and I serve on diversity and inclusion here at Emory and helping with diversity and inclusion in higher education. So that's me.
Perfect. Morgan, do you want to go next? I can't see you guys in front of me, so I'm just calling random names out, but I know are there.
You're good. Hi, thank you for having me. I'm also saddened that we have to have this conversation. I am thankful that we are, and that you all are facilitating this and creating this brave space for all of us, and an opportunity for folks to learn and to come together during this time. I am a queer Black woman, and I like to refer to myself as a theater practitioner. I am also the COO of a CBD wellness company named Carry Wellness in the heart of Richmond. And I am really passionate about marijuana justice and the healing properties of cannabis and all of those good things. I'm also the program coordinator of a Richmond nonprofit called Spectrum RVA, and we facilitate youth-led plays and youth leadership. So heavy focus on what the youth can do and how they can touch our communities. Yeah, that's all about me.
Awesome. Thank you, Morgan, for sharing. Next up, we have Reverend Dr. Donique McIntosh.
Good evening. I am, well, I was going to use the word happy to be here, except, given the topic, I don't know that happy is the right way to describe exactly how I'm feeling, but I am grateful for the opportunity to come together in community to have this conversation. And a little bit about my background. I do social justice education work. I've primarily done it in higher education, but also with community organizations, nonprofits. And I currently work as a minister for racial justice for the Southern New England Conference of the United Church of Christ.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing. And then do we have Lisette Cross on the line? Reverend Lisette? It looks like we might have had a last minute change in attendees for the panelists. My bad. So Natasha and I are also going to take a minute just to introduce ourselves, who we are and where we are from, and who is hosting this event here. So my name is Anthony Johnson. I am a member of Black Pride RVA. I'm the vice president of UGRC, the nonprofit that supports the program of Black Pride RVA. That brought you Black Pride last year in July and the year before that, and that we were anticipating bringing you our trilogy is how we're going to go after that this year. But in the current events of today's world, we had to cancel that as well, as you all are aware. So not only that takes me back to not only are we dealing with a crisis in our community, but a global crisis on top of that as well, that's adding compound pressure to this. And that just hit me. So I apologize for the out of turn talking about that. But I've been with Black Pride RVA for the past year. And I will tell you, it infuriates me that we are here today for this reason, having this conversation after so many before have been had to this point. And while I'm glad that all the panelists and all the attendees could be here, I think this is such a critical and fundamental conversation that we need to have. And what's more important than the words that we speak in this setting today, that we hear from you all, our panelists, are definitely going to be the actions that we take and that we influence others to take, right? Because it's not just our job to lift the boot of oppression off of us, it's also the oppressors' job. So leaving this call today, I would love to make sure that we are able to understand what our roles look like in that. And I can't wait to hear from you, the panelists, on how we do that. So Tasha, do you want to take a minute to introduce yourself?
Thank you, Ed. I'm Natasha Crosby. I am the treasurer of Us Giving Richmond Connections. You guys also might know me from the Richmond LGBTQ Chamber and Side by Side as well. I'm also a realtor here in the area. and a very long-standing opponent of police brutality and injustice. So that is one of the reasons why I involve myself in the community as such, and one of the reasons why I pushed for and pushed for us to have this today. So I'm very eager to get this conversation started and to see how we can continue this conversation moving forward.
Awesome. Thanks, Natasha. So we'll go ahead and kick it off and get started here. The first question that we have, we are here tonight to talk about the injustices that the queer and trans community the queer and trans community of color, rather, have faced in the hands of police. We could talk about this year, the past decade, the past century, what have you. We are still in the same situation today. So with that said, what support does the queer and trans community need right now, the queer and trans community of color right now need in today's environment, navigating today's media cycles and the events that we see today? And whichever of the panelists want to lead us in answering that first question can take the reins.
Cool. First three things that always come to mind when I even think of my close relatives and friends is money, housing, mental health services. Of course, there are a myriad of things, but those fundamental staples keep coming up time and time again. And so, there are a bunch of nonprofit organizations doing the work and that are reaching out to, I can speak for Richmond. I know Nations in particular is doing a stellar job time after time. And for these organizations to flourish, they need money. Their organizers need mental health resources, so those just off the bat come to me.
Thank you. Thank you.
One of the things that comes to mind for me is around the need for education. And part of the work that I do here where I live in New England is helping to, right now my work is primarily centered on doing racial justice workshops with predominantly white congregations, but in a few months my work will also comprise doing education around heterosexism and gender oppression, and obviously looking at the intersections of those as well. And so part of how we combat oppression is through education. And so that is not always like a more immediate sort of fix or solution, but certainly part of a larger, like multi-pronged approach to creating change or being supported.
Thank you yeah. And so to follow up with that, like, who would your audience be in particular for the education that you're talking about?
So here in where I live and work, we have a little over 600 churches that I work with around racial justice workshops, developing curriculum, putting in place some accountability measures so that people, specifically white people, are being held accountable for actually engaging in anti-racist practice, and will, again, eventually include being inclusive and affirming of the spectrum of LGBTQIA people.
Very good. Very good.
I agree with all what was said. One of the things that popped in my head when this question came up, and it made me think of on last night watching the versus battle with Kirk Franklin and Fred Hammond, they ran through all the names, but did not mention the women at first, nor did they mention any queer people of color, trans people of color. And so being acknowledged, the support from all the community, from everyone, we tend to join in with everything, but no one joins in and helps us. And so feeling supported from everyone and having that voice and being heard and being acknowledged that there is a problem in this community with police brutality.
Absolutely. And I think that that's a really critical point. Go ahead.
I was just saying, even outside of Pride Month, outside of the month of July, June. Ooh, where are we at?
Black Pride in July. We got you. We were picking up what you were putting down. You were down for the good cause. Mm-hmm. Down for the good cause. Yeah, no, but Dr. Range, you brought up a really good point that, we show up for everyone else, right? Like there's an image in my mind right now of one non-POC police officer in a riot over the weekend where there is a string of Black men. He was separated from his police unit, but there is a string of Black men standing in front of him, protecting him from what was sure to happen to him by himself. So even in the midst of this chaos, we're still showing up and doing what's right and protecting other people.
Yeah, and we're just not protecting our community. Like they're not protecting our community at all.
Right. They're not reciprocating the favor.
Yeah.
Very good. Very good. So one of the things that we think about is, with the focus on our queer and trans folk of color here, being victimized by the police. Like when we think about fighting for recognition, and not even that we want to be recognized for this, right? But we want to be acknowledged, to your point, Tim. When we think about getting that acknowledgement and we think about the different injustices that we face, if there are no queer or trans people of color in different spaces that need to hear our stories, who should be telling those stories? And when is it appropriate for them to tell those stories? And I'll ask that of the full panel. I think what we see is a lot of the times in corporate settings, right? Like you get folks who say, I want to help, but I don't know what to do, right? But where we are absent, those stories still need to be told. So how can we get those stories into those spaces might also be another good question.
Well, and I was thinking I think it falls back on what Dr. McIntosh was saying is educating everyone on the issues and making sure that they're aware of the issues and that they're willing to speak out on those issues. We have a lot of people who are silent allies, but then that doesn't make them an ally if they're silent. Mm-hmm. And so being willing to have that conversation, being willing to talk about it, I don't know, something to start with. I don't have an answer because this weekend for me was rough and my emotions are all over the place. And one of the things I shared with my church, so I'm a part of Restoration Fellowship RVA. That's also my connection here with Reverend Lisette and everyone. But one of the big emotions I had this weekend was like, just burn it all, like get rid of it all. And so I don't care who's talking about it. Everybody burn it. Just burn it. Like, yeah, bump it all, like get rid of it all. But to your question, who should be talking and when? I think everyone needs to be talking and just starting those conversations, no matter if you don't know what to talk about. I know on today I had 2 white women in my life, someone who I've known since kindergarten, and then someone who I worked with reach out to me today to just let me know, like, I don't know what to do. I'm a white woman and I don't know how to help. I know this is wrong, and I'm willing to learn. And that was enough for me, and that was enough to start that conversation of, okay, this is what you can do. These are things that you can think about. These are the conversations you can have. And one of them, she's a minister. She's a pastor of her own church, and she's wanting to learn more. She's wanting to be educated so that she can speak the right message to her congregation. So that's where I'm at.
So
Perfect. Thank you for sharing.
Sorry.
Okay.
Some of what I have been working on here, again in New England, particularly because it is such a white area is trying to build up white people's capacity to engage in those conversations and be doing more of the work themselves, so that they are relying less and less on people of color to educate them and to tell them, give them suggestions about what it makes sense to be doing. And sometimes, that's tricky because in an ideal world, I would love for it to be somebody that I could say, this person is a strong ally, and I know, that they're actively working to be anti-racist, and unfortunately, in my experience, most people are not aware enough or intentionally trying to be anti-racist on a day-to-day basis. And so I know, again, ideally I can't have what I would like to have, but so not having that, again, I just am working to build up their capacity through, making blog posts and doing the racial justice workshops and trying to recruit white facilitators to have some conversation. We're doing a youth town hall, and I am specifically looking for young white youth to engage in this work. We need to be thinking about raising a generation of white kids, who are going to be anti-racist. And so that's just some of the approaches that I'm using here.
Very good. Very good. Morgan, did you want to weigh in on that question too? It's a tough one.
First, I know it is, but thank you for the work that you're doing with those young whites and whites willing to be in the room, because that's incredibly important. And I hadn't, yes, I've been around folks willing to be in the room, but that didn't pop up immediately in my mind as a solution. And that really hit home to me. One of my favorite teachers who does work in racial justice, she, every time we have a show around Blackness, she makes everyone stay in the room so we can have a dialogue afterward. And a lot of white people want to fight her on about the things that they've seen, because in these shows there's blackface and there's whiteface and there's minstrelsy and there's a whole lot going on. But the reason why they want to challenge her so much is because the words aren't coming from a white mouth. So raising that generation of white folks willing to stand up for us and our siblings. Wow, what a solution. That's all I got.
All right. So really good response there. So thinking about the next question that we have, I feel like we've already answered this because this is going to be a theme yeah.
I'm so sorry. I know that we are having a very, this is an open discussion. So I wanted to expound on a couple of the points that Dr. Tim and Dr. Donique made.
Please jump in.
So Dr. Tim, you mentioned burning it down, right? Like that was the feeling that you had. And I want to be clear, because of the people who are on this panel and the people who are attending this discussion, what do you mean by that, and why do you feel that way?
So my initial, when I initially felt the feeling of burning it down, burning everything down and just starting fresh, it was literally like, it didn't matter. Buildings, politics, everything, getting it all and just starting over. And that's just where it was at for me. And it was the initial emotion was from the destruction that was happening and the riots and things like that. And my mindset kind of changed over time to, well, let's do a little bit of destruction, not in our community. Let's pick the other people community, the non-melanated community, the people with the other hue community, and let's burn their stuff down and hit their pockets, because money seems to drive them. And so we get rid of the stuff for them. They're going to want to make change for us. So that's where I meant burning it down. But I guess now it is, if I say burn it down, it is, I'm thinking I would also go more politically now. Let's burn it down to the point where we are having those elected officials that are speaking, that are fighting for us, that are wanting to fight for us. Let's make sure that we are talking to our representatives and making sure our voices are being heard and advocating for ourselves more. My emotions are still raw, so I don't know what that looks like and how to go about that outside of just saying the traditional thing of just go vote locally, vote and that's all that and all that jazz. But outside of that, right now, I don't have an answer more than that. Yeah.
Well, no, thank you. I appreciate that. And Dr. Danique, you mentioned raising a generation of white anti-racists. And I think that could be, for generationally, that in itself is extremely powerful to actually raise those who will continue to help us in our struggle moving forward. Because we all know what is happening now, but we all know also what has happened before. And a lot of these instances come and go. So thinking long term and trying to bring, justice to this country for Black people and queer people of color. What does raising an anti-racist look like? What are some actionable steps that you believe white households can take upon themselves to raise anti-racists?
So some of it, I think I'm still uncovering. I have been in this position just since the fall. And actually what sort of spurred my thinking about that was knowing that white supremacists recruit, and they recruit young white men. And I was just thinking about the fact that, as a Christian, I feel like Christians have something to offer young white men who might also potentially be recruited. So for the other side, so to speak. And so again, part of my thinking about it was because I do a lot of education around racial justice. And because I have access to over 600 churches here, again, whose members are predominantly white, in my mind, it just makes sense, for us to be thinking about different ways to make impact. And when churches, or people, when families attend churches and they do Christian education, part of that needs to be about what it means to be anti-racist. To be anti-racist is to be in line with the social gospel, the gospel that Jesus preached. And so part of what I'm developing is curriculum for Christian educators to use with families to incorporate anti-racist pedagogy into some of their materials. Some of it also will probably look like young people being exposed to protests and rallies. We talked about doing voter education drives. I mean, voting is something that drives a lot of, well, not voting, but elections and legislation, and people being elected to positions, impact a lot of our lives. Like, this is how, racism and gender oppression and heterosexism and other isms get written into public policy. So we're also, we'll be doing campaigns where we're educating about voter registrations and things like that. So those are only two of the things that I've thought of as it specifically relates to raising anti-racist young white people. I anticipate that there will be more sort of meat added to that as I continue in the work, because it's an area where I feel like we could focus some change.
Absolutely. I love that work. And I love that ideology. And my first reaction to hearing that is, they adopt the rest of our culture. Why not You know, like, I don't mean to be petty on this call, but like, we have the influence, so why not use it the best that we can? And I think that I would love to hear more about that work.
Well, I mean, racism, just like any other ism, you know, it's taught. You don't come out of the womb being racist. You don't come out of the womb, you know, being heterosexist or being transphobic. Like it's taught. It's taught. And so if it's something that is taught, that means that we can teach a different. What somebody said, no, please be petty.
I think we're there. I think we're there.
You know, but it means that we can teach, you know, something different. And I feel like as people of faith, particularly as a Christian, I feel like we have a responsibility to teach something different. And so that's what I'm, again, part of why I'm working on that particular facet of the work.
Awesome. Natasha, do we have any follow-up questions that we want to ask at this point from the audience, from the listeners?
Yeah, we do have a few questions coming in now. Let's see. The first one is from an attendant, and they're asking, even though a lot of white people are burning things down, do you think we would be getting the coverage and actions without this phenomenon of destruction? And that's a very interesting question, because I actually recently had a conversation with someone who was adamant that we should only do car rallies and only protest peacefully because they have the same effect. And I thought, I thought that was extremely funny, right? Because if they had the same effect, we wouldn't be here.
Right.
We've seen on a national level this, at least not in this generation, a national protest to this extent with this type of destruction, because year after year, murder after murder, we continue to see injustice, and we continue to peacefully protest and things like that. And that justice never came for us. And so now at the end of it, well, what we are seeing is an uprising. Now it's, oh, why can't you peacefully protest?
Y'all missed the peaceful protest. We tried that already.
Thank you. That's exactly the one I was going to
say. Y'all missed it. Like, I'm sorry. When we were peacefully protesting, nobody wanted to listen. It wasn't effective. And it didn't seem to matter that Black lives were at stake then. So, like, when I hear that, I get triggered. So, Dr. Tim, did you want to respond to that?
A little. I think it's a combination of both. We need both to make things move forward. We need the peaceful protests, and we also need the riots and things like that. We need all coverage happening. And so I think both happens in any instance of change. It was part of the civil rights movement. There was peaceful protests, but there were also riots and things like that going on. And so we need all of that, from Martin Luther King to the Black Panthers to Malcolm X. We need all of it. I was a person who believed in the idea of peaceful protest and that we need to be peaceful and things like that. But much like you guys are expressing, you are expressing that I'm sick of peace right now, and let's get down to business.
Like Dr. said earlier, if it doesn't hit them in their pocket, it doesn't matter.
Exactly.
They won't pay attention if they're in the suburbs and we're in the city, until it really affects their day-to-day lives. And so also when it comes to rebellion and change, violence is a part of that natural progression. So I don't think, yes, both and peaceful protest and rioting and things like that, but it shouldn't be frowned upon. We know that there is a next step. We know that after all of this, what, unfortunately feels like chaos and is a bit, there is that next step. And so rather than focusing on glass that can be swept up, buildings that can be repaired,
that are insured.
Murdered. Pay attention to that. How do we fix that system? They have insurance.
Yeah. I think one important point to note as we attempt to answer this question and all of the questions in tonight's discussion is that none of us are all going to have the all-encompassing answer to fix any of these problems. And it's not our job to do that. like, let's just acknowledge that, like, it is not our job to wholeheartedly be responsible for fixing a mess we didn't create. And secondly, when I think about all that destruction that we're talking about, what's interesting is that a lot of it is being caused by white rioters out there attempting to support us. And yet we are the ones taking responsibility for those actions, because we're the ones getting labeled as the looters, as the rioters, as the thugs, as the damaging and the destructive citizens in society that are unproductive. Like, that's what they're saying about us when we're not in the room. And in this instance, not all of it is being caused by us, but we don't hear anything about these white counterparts causing this destruction either. So anybody else want to weigh in on that piece, that follow-up question that Natasha just brought us? Natasha, do we have any others that we want to hit on, or do we want to go ahead and maybe move to some other questions?
There are definitely some more questions here, but they kind of align with some of the questions that we have. So I think we can go back to asking the questions that we have, and then I'll tie them in with the questions.
Perfect. Perfect. Yeah, no, and we will also have time at the end to go through Q&A. So as we do these intermittent stops, I just want to make sure that we are able to address anything that's pressing for that moment. So we definitely want to hear what our attendees have to say today as well too. So in thinking through all that we're seeing today, how do we bring that trans lens to the forefront that is often so very forgotten? And I'm going to allow any of the panelists to start on that question. How do we bring the trans lens into perspective that is so often forgotten and or buried, I should say?
I feel like for me as an ally to the trans community, that it is incumbent upon me to speak out when I have the opportunity to do that. And so, for instance, in January, I did a set of speeches for Martin Luther King Day, and I made sure that I cited examples of instances where trans people of color were victims of hate crimes. And so for me, I just feel like I have to. That feels like the right thing to do, to use my privilege in that way to highlight what's going on in the trans community. But I think part of it for me is also feeling a sense of connection. They're human beings just like I am, and I am concerned about what happens to trans people just like I am, any community that's facing violence in all its different forms. So for me, it's just it's just a have to for me.
Thank you. Morgan?
Yeah, I completely agree. Acknowledging the privilege that we have as cisgender siblings, creating the brave spaces for them, if they choose to pass them the mic, because it's not always for me to say, but if I'm given the opportunity to speak for that community, that the right word, I'm educated, the right words are being said, and yeah, within our, within this, I'm going to say it, revolution that we're going through right now, and our list of demands, what we want to accomplish, that they are at the table with the pen as well, because it is our duty to protect them as much as it is to protect ourselves.
Absolutely. All Black Lives Matter, right?
I agree. Morgan, you actually took my point. That was exactly my point. Allowing trans people to have a voice at the table, and not recognizing trans as less than, because we tend to recognize trans as less than, and cis is what is natural and normal. What is natural and normal? I'm a scientist by training, and gender is not designed in genetics, because there are people who are XY male, XX female, but there are XXY, there are XXX. Like, what does that mean? And so recognizing that trans is not less than, that it's trans is a part of it, and it's as equal as cis. There shouldn't be any difference. And then kind of small gestures that I do is just trying to recognize that I use the proper pronouns. One thing that got me with Tony McDade is that they were using the wrong pronouns in the media often, and that infuriated me.
Yeah, that's such an proper pronoun usage, and just even if you don't know, like simply admitting that you don't know what the right pronouns are. Can I I don't mean to be rude, but what are your pronouns? Can I please, like those steps can be uncomfortable, but like the uncomfortability that we experience in those areas is so less severe than the pain that we cause by just assuming, right? And I think one thing that we do to see more than often is that violence in the media. Not just, we definitely see that violence in the media, that blatant disregard for someone's existence, their most authentic, true, and genuine existence. And so they continue to cause damage even after death, right? It's like it never ends. And I think that's a really, really important thing to call out. So thank you for mentioning that.
Yeah, one of the things that I just remembered when I was doing the research for the Martin Luther King Day speeches that I referenced a minute ago, that there was something in the research about how frequently trans people are misgendered in reporting. So the reporting about the violence that's happening is actually being underreported because trans people are being misgendered, which I think in my mind at least is connected to some of the questions that you all had listed about elected officials and just ways of creating change. And I think part of that is about policing and how we begin to demand accountability from police departments, from the Justice Department, and other organizations that are charged with protecting us.
That's a great call out and a great segue into our next question. So how do we demand better from our elected officials and reject harmful anti-transgender legislation appearing at the local and state and federal levels? So do you have any examples of ways that we can hold those folks accountable, and what actions can we take? Dr. Tim, maybe you want to lead us in that question? Again, I know that none of us have the all-encompassing answers to these things. Like, these are such heavy-hitting questions, and here we are trying to be the face of the race.
Yeah, I know. That question, when I saw the question in there, and I was like, "Yep, this one I don't know."
And I think it's important that we say that, right?
Yeah,
like,
I don't know. It's important
to acknowledge that we don't know what's in here.
I don't know. Again, I think just electing the officials that align with what you want and making sure you stay on top of them. Reaching out to them and communicating your needs. But yeah, that was one of the questions on the list. I was like, please, I'm gonna lean on you all to answer.
Naturally, I lean on you to respond. Naturally. Morgan, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I was gonna say that I look to organizations that get these folks to the polls. You are utilizing our votes, you're utilizing our time, our energy. Apply pressure for what we need. Apply pressure and don't hold up. And so building those relationships with those elected officials extends beyond the campaign. It extends beyond the time that they're sworn in. Whether, I don't know what the agenda would be, monthly check-ins, whatever, but making sure that whatever organization is connecting with that individual, that the opinions and voices and needs of the people within these organizations isn't being lost when that elected official is in their office trying to figure out what to do next,
and how to get reelected. Yeah. Dr. Revan, anything else you want to add in on that one?
Me or somebody else? I didn't hear what you said.
I'm sorry. Is there anything else that you'd want to add in on that, Dr. Reverend? The Reverend Doctor. I'm sorry.
That's
I did it all backwards.
That's
what it was. I totally butchered all the years of hard work you put in to get to where you are. That's what that was.
It's all good. Well, I think that just to add to some of what's already been said, I mean, and I don't want to, beat the dead horse about the voting, except to say that it does have an impact. We have power to elect people, to public office that, hold our values and have our interests at heart. And so if we, take the time, we're voting these people into office, but then it's also about, when there's a bill that has come up about a particular issue, and following up with those elected officials, like writing and calling, like they want to hear from their constituents. And again, they work for us essentially. So we have an obligation, to be reaching out to those elected officials to make sure that they are representing our interests. I think another sort of option is to get connected with or donate to organizations like the ACLU. They will often take on legal cases for people in underrepresented communities, like communities of color, trans people, other people, in the LGBT spectrum. They do advocacy on our behalf as well. And sometimes they do education around particular issues in communities as well. So those are some of the ways that we can work to create some of the change that we want and need.
Yeah. And I think that, and Tasha, I want to pass the mic to you because I know how you're very politically active and your voice is very loud in that space, as it should be. But one of the things I think about in this question in particular, yes, it's a hard question to answer. And I would love it if any of our attendees on the call today, our participants in the audience, if any of you have feedback that you would like to share on this question specifically, please drop that in the Q&A box. And I'll ask the question again. How do we demand better from our elected officials and reject harmful anti-transgender legislation appearing at local, state, and federal levels? For me, it goes back to my first thought is the representation piece. Like, we have to be represented. If we're underreported statistically as things that are happening to us matter that they make legislation about, then how do we become represented, politically? The census is coming up. What organizations are pushing the current census? That's happening right now. What organizations are pushing the census? What organizations are pushing voter registration? And I believe we already lose the census deadline? Was that May 14th?
It is not over yet. You can still fill out the census right now. You can continue.
Thank you, Tasha.
Census up until
Thank you, Tasha.
September, I believe. So
look, August 14th. I knew it was the 14th. August 14th, I believe, is the cutoff date here. I did my part. So I already was like, wait, when is this over? Like, I knew I had to do my part already. It's my bad.
I did
August
mine
14th. Too. Thank you. August 14th is the deadline for those of you on this call. Please participate in the census. And we will provide links through our social media on how you can do that at a later date. But Tasha, what are your thoughts on this question?
So first off, just to reiterate about the census, and the importance of communities that are underrepresented being participants in the census. The census has historically been the tool used to delegate funding to areas, across the country, right? So they base it off of, the population, the tax status, all that. And they're like, oh, okay, well, we need to put dollars here. Now, historically, they have geared the census away from underrepresented populations. They come into our neighborhoods and they tell us not to do the census. There have been Black people murdered for trying to fill out a census. So historically, we have not had the same chance to participate in the census. And so now that we can, and don't misunderstand me, they are definitely still trying to direct the census away from Black and brown people. But we do have access to it, so we need to take advantage of the access that we have and fill out the census so that we can get those dollars into our neighborhoods who have needed those dollars for longer than we all can remember. So please fill out the census. You have until August 14th. Census.gov is where you can go. Census.gov, and I'll drop it off in the chat. But to the question being asked, and I'm just going to reiterate what Dr. Donique and Morgan said, and maybe expound a little bit. But we definitely have tools to this now, right? The LGBT Dems are a Virginia-based LGBTQ focused organization, and we need to hold them accountable to include us in their lobbying efforts. We live in a society where lobbying is king. If you have an entity that can go out and fight for you day in and day out as lobbyists do, then we should be able to start to see some change through that effort. So what we need to do as queer and trans people of color is hold these entities, these nonprofits who already have the in line. They're already there. And they say they represent us too. So let's hold them accountable to make sure that they are speaking up for us in this instance. So we need to hold them accountable for speaking up to our elected officials about police brutality and greater injustices in the queer Black community. And also, like Dr. Donique said, connecting them all together. You know, Equality Virginia, ACLU, and I know some people might think it might be a bit crass to name people, to put people out there, but I think we're far past what classifies as crass. I need to know that we're, after this discussion and after the people who are participating on this call, this is a call to action as well. We need, if you are an LGBTQ org in any way, shape, or fashion, the fact that you are standing in RVA right now means that you have a voice. And we need you to represent the Black queer community just as much as you represent the whole.
Mm-hmm.
Just to add on to that, I think one of the other avenues is partnering with community-based organizations who might be doing community organizing. And a lot of times the organizing is done, what's the phrase? It's like multiple issue campaigns. It's typically not just, sometimes they are single issue focused, but a lot of times they are coalitions of people from, like all sort of walks of life who come together based on their particular self-interest, but end up doing, work that addresses broader communities' concerns. So all that to say, there could be an organization, or maybe depending on where you live, multiple organizations already engaging in some of the work that is intersectional. And it's looking at, again, broader issues than just say poverty or affordable housing or, education, but also taking into consideration the needs of Black LGBTQ community.
Awesome, thank you. Do any of our panelists want to continue to weigh in on this topic? Okay. So this next question that we have, I do feel like it's been answered, but the importance of it is so much there that I feel like I want to ask it again and just try to to see if there's any additional response that we want to have from this question specifically. And I think about the importance of this, and I think about the George Floyd video, right? I only watched a couple of seconds of it because after you've watched one, you know how the rest of them end, quite frankly, and it's how much trauma do you want to subject yourself to. But in this video, in the clip that I saw of it, what I saw is one man's knee to the back of one man's neck, and at least 3 others standing around watching him, silent, complicit, not doing anything to use their voice to make a difference. All it would have taken was one person in that circle to speak up, to do the right thing, to use their voice. So when we think about our allies specifically, and again, I know that we've covered this, but I want to cover it one more time just to make sure we drive that point home for the allies on the call. How can we engage our allies and encourage them to be accomplices and to not be complicit? Your knee might not be on the backs of our necks directly, but how do you speak up when others need to lift that knee up?
My question for the allies is, what are you afraid of?
Flip it, Morgan, come on.
What are you afraid of? What do you have to lose? Ask yourself that question and read some books.
Good question. Very good question, Morgan. And I think that's a hard question for a lot of our allies to answer, right? That's when we get into respectability politics. That's when we get into, oh, I don't want to piss off Aunt Karen. Well, I'm sorry, Aunt Karen, you're problematic. Okay? You're problematic.
So what do we... It ain't that good anyway.
Thank you, Morgan.
I don't think there's more to be said, but that I think that was enough. But I think, yeah, using your voice, like speaking out against it, breaking down that good old boy mentality, and getting rid of all that stuff. Like, you have privilege. You are moving in the world of privilege. You don't need people to support you in that. You're gonna get that privilege no matter what. Try to support other people. Think of other people and where they are struggling and need help and dying.
Absolutely.
So one of the,
Dr. Donna, please go ahead.
I was just going to say, I mean, because I do racial justice workshops and have done it for a long time with white people, you know, I think some part of it is, I mean, obviously some part of it is fear, and it's in a inability or unwillingness to go into something that makes them uncomfortable. And I remember a few months ago in a, and it wasn't like a full workshop, it was just a consultation I was doing with the church, and one of the white women, you know, said something about being uncomfortable. And so she didn't want to keep going. And I was like, no, this, that can't be our standard. You know, like your comfort just cannot be our standard. Like people, some of us are just trying to live. So part of it, you know, part of my responsibility in the work that I do is to do that nudging sometimes, but it's also, again, for me, about getting white people in conversation with other white people. So sometimes, you know, they're going to be resistant to hearing something from me, and I'm tired of saying it sometimes. But I'm working to create spaces for white people to be in conversation with each other and to help hold each other accountable for doing something different than what we've been doing.
Absolutely. Tasha, you had a point you wanted to make?
Thank you all for those answers. Those are excellent answers, very excellent answers. I appreciate each and every one of them. I just wanted to just expound a little bit on them, and maybe put a challenge out there for allies, right? Let's take a look at what's happening now and the uproar over property damage. And I think this is a great way to really break it down. If you take a look at how quickly it was and how easily it was for people to come out against property damage, it happened overnight. they saw, you know, the glass break on the building, and everybody knew instantly that that was wrong, that shouldn't happen, right? That was the instant, oh, they're breaking shit? Why would they be doing that? How does that make sense? That was the reaction, right? Over property damage. Mm-hmm. So I encourage you to have the conversation with other people who look like you about why you can so instantly have the conclusion that property damage is wrong, and see on video people busting glass and tagging things and breaking stuff. You saw that on video and you were instantly confirmed that that was wrong and that shouldn't happen. We're asking you to see the murders that have been on video year after year after year after year after year after year after year
after year, keep going.
After year, and ask yourselves why you can't jump to how wrong that is. Ask yourselves why it takes so long to acknowledge that that is wrong and that shouldn't be happening. And why would they do that to Americans on American soil?
Because they were socialized that we are animals and we are less than. Sorry, Kim Green, your comment struck me so much. It just struck me, the comment. But when we Black people were property on this very soil, it was cool to damage us. And it's still cool in some levels because they're socialized to think it's cool. It is okay for us to be damaged. Our pain doesn't matter. We don't have pain. It is okay to sit on our necks. It is okay for us to say that we can't breathe because we should be able to breathe. We don't have pain. We're not human in the sense that they are. Their pain is so much more. And if I could go back to a comment in the section asking about what can allies do when it's not about fear, but coming from a cushioned spot, come out that cushioned spot, have that conversation. Being here is good for you right now. You're learning so much, and you're pushing yourself to move from that cushioned spot. Start having those conversations. Reach out to people and ask them how they're feeling, how they're doing, and then what can you do to help. Join in the organizations and the communities that need the help and figure out what to do. Sorry, I felt tears in my eyes. Yeah.
No, thank you. Like that's why we're here. Like this is why we are here right now for this conversation. And you know, when we think about the idea of comfort, right? Like I would much rather sit through a white person struggling to be comfortable to address a difficult topic and not having all the right words than to watch them stand idly by while Black lives suffer and die. I would much more be willing to sit in a room of white folks struggling to say the words Black bodies killed and going around that than to sit idly by and watch as we die in the streets, you know? And you know, there are going to be times where, for the allies on the call, where you attempt to speak up and you say the wrong thing and you are not met with grace. Guess what? Get over it. Take those feelings, push them away, and get over it. Because it's not about that moment in time. It's about the bigger picture, because we have to always see the bigger picture. We have to always see the bigger picture because we have to think 5 steps ahead because our lives depend on it. So for you, I need to challenge all of our allies to see the bigger picture. Okay, when you are uncomfortable, when you are afraid of the backlash you're going to get from the very people you're trying to protect, deal with it.
What about our uncomfortability? What do we have to go through?
Because lives are on the stake.
Yeah, I don't care about your comfortability at this point because I've been uncomfortable for 36 years of my life. I have had to position myself in a way of being non-threatening so I don't get killed.
Looking over your shoulder.
Running around my neighborhood, I'm looking around to make sure I don't look threatening. I'm wearing all these bright, flashy colors with all this workout gear just so people know I'm working out so I don't get shot and killed. Or I don't walk around with a do-rag on or anything and nothing to cover my locks because I don't want anyone to think anything's going to happen to me. Get out of your uncomfortability. And yes, white fragility is a real thing. And I don't care about it. Get out of it. Like, it don't matter.
Well, and it's driven from a place of ego, right? So it's this place of ego, this fear to be humble, this fear to admit that you don't know everything. Right? And I'm not saying that every white person is trying to walk around like they know everything. I'm not trying to say that, but like, let go of your ego. It's okay to not have the answer either, but say it. And don't go on doing damage, assuming that you don't want other people to know that you don't know what the real answer is, and just adopting what's always been because it's what you know. Well, what you know doesn't work. And I think that that's what we're here to say.
I think what also happens is that white people have been allowed, at least in their minds, to be individuals as opposed to members of a social group. So when you're talking about, when we're talking about white people, they think we're talking about somebody else, not them. And so part of, again, the work, at least for me, is to begin to get, to help white people see, well, for us, we're saying white people, we mean.
Well, and we're
people,
talking to
all
whiteness.
white people, we're generalizing about a group of people. We've seen patterns, of particular behaviors that we could attribute to a particular racial group, and we need you to know that. And so you don't get off, free of being considered an individual. No, you are a member of a group of white people that we need to do something different. Stop killing Black people.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Natasha, do we have any questions? We have gone past our first hour here, and I think that we've fallen into some really, really great discussion. So thank you to all of our panelists for your vulnerability and the courage to share on this panel. I think it's really, really important. I want to take a minute to kind of dive into the questions that we're getting from the audience that is listening to this call. Tasha, do you have a couple questions that you want to share with the panel here? And if we're not ready, I can ask a couple of other questions to keep the conversation going.
No, absolutely. We definitely have some questions here from the participants that we can ask.
Awesome, thank you.
I just have one here and I tried to answer this one in the chat as well, but I wanted to ask all of you, what are some Virginia-based organizations that allies can support?
Black Pride RVA. Nations with a Z Foundation. Mm-hmm. Marijuana Justice.
My Church Restoration Fellowship RVA.
Song Southerners on New Ground. There are a lot of others. I'm looking now.
And I think what's important too is this is a really, really great question. We can collect a list of many different organizations that we're talking about today and more. And we can share those on our social media if you look for us on Facebook and Instagram, Black Pride RVA. And I see that we've dropped some in the chat too.
Yes, yes. So the next question I have here is pertaining to the recent activity with Richmond City and the Richmond School Board. And this one is directed towards Dr. McIntosh. It says, I am becoming increasingly aware and concerned about the upcoming school year. In light of the changes in the schools due to the pandemic and the need to social distance in the classroom, the issue of community policing, where school resource officers are always present in middle and high schools. Would you speak to this issue and also have all of the panelists offer remarks from their perspective?
I first want to say I don't actually reside in Richmond, and most of my education experience was in higher ed, not K through 12. So one of the other two panelists, or maybe somebody else who's watching, might be better able to answer that question.
Sure, Tasha, can you ask the question one more time and let's see if the panel can take a hit at it? And if not, we might be able to answer that offline as well.
So I can't answer that question. My background is higher education as well, and I've always been in the college, but the little insights I guess I can get from it, and I'm going back to the question to read it for myself again, because I remember this question when it was asked, and I thought it was a great question. The point of the issue of community policing, where schools resources officers are also present in middle and high school. Trying to think of how to answer this. I don't know. Yeah, I would have to think more about how to answer this question because I thought it was a really great question, and I was thinking about it as we were going through, and then other things started to come up. I'm sorry. Yeah.
No, and that's okay. Listen,
Well,
I said at the beginning of this, we're not going to have all the answers, so we'll do our best. We'll do our best.
And I think maybe, you know, I definitely don't have the answer as well, right? But when it comes to school resource officers, and also in light of Richmond City recently defunding racial justice work within the school systems, you know, we know that just what we generally know, right? We generally know that school resource officers affect Black students at a higher rate than white students, right? We generally know that racial justice work is imperative in school systems to speak to things like raising an anti-racist white child, right? So if we're defunding that, then we know that that's no longer on the table. So I think this is a good question to kind of tie in using the organizations that are supposed to represent us to speak to these inequities. Since we no longer have the funding for Richmond City to do racial justice work, but we still have the funding to supply the schools with resource officers that negatively affect, you know, Black and brown kids. Why is that injustice allowed to carry on? I think that's the question that we can at least, it may not be an answer, but that's a question that we can take to our elected officials, right? Like that's a point of concern for us, right? At least that's my understanding, is that we care about, you know, the over policing of Black bodies, and that is also happening within our school system. So what can we do as organizations with boots on the ground to be able to combat that?
What was the rationale for not continuing the funding?
The pandemic. They used the pandemic and no longer having you know, the money, because of all the money having to be spent on the pandemic, even though they're receiving millions of dollars for education due to the pandemic. They are still deciding to X that out of the budget while switching the curriculum for math and a few other subjects as well. So they're willing to pay millions of dollars to change the curriculum on an untested basis, right? They're just kind of throwing money at this new idea. Let's see if it works. But they're not gonna. They've already defunded racial equity work within the school systems. So, you know, why does that happen? Why is that injustice allowed to go on? And how can us, these organizations, and our allies speak up for Black people across the board in our school systems and in our day-to-day life?
And to that point, Tasha really said everything. I grew up in Richmond, and I'm still living here. And I've had the privilege to work with organizations that go into schools, and we teach them Shakespeare and we teach them different things. But, you know, arts education, some of those programs have been canceled in a lot of Richmond public schools. We also work in the surrounding counties, but a lot of Richmond public schools, because they don't see a need for children to have access to those things. And speaking with the youth, they want those things. They do find it to be a benefit. And especially with the lack of mental health funding in lower education, a lot of these youths at home who are dealing with whatever family situation that they usually would have a break from at school, or would have an opportunity to talk with a counselor, now all of that is gone. And who's to say? I'm not even gonna think about that. I'm not gonna go down that rabbit hole, but it is our job as leadership and as members of organizations to say, I see you, I see what you've done. We need to amplify that. Yeah, thank you, Tasha, for all of that.
Of course. I do have one more question here. And it's speaking to the pandemic and how that is disproportionately affecting Black people, and what that response has looked like, and the injustice in what we have seen, even previous to the recent police brutality that brought on all of the unrest. There was definite racial disparities in the way that this pandemic has been unfolding. Systemic, definitely. Long-standing issues of injustice have negatively affected Black people during this worldwide pandemic, and then also the choices that our leaders have decided to make now also are negatively affecting us, and most likely will continue to negatively affect us for some time into the future. So how do you all, and I'm going to put this out to you all, how do you all see us battling that oppression and the oppression that will follow while we are trying to bring about the idea of just Black decency among all the people of this nation?
I'm sorry, what was the question? I heard it and I feel like I lost it.
Right, I get to rambling sometimes, so my apologies. Well, but it's basically about the pandemic, how it is disproportionately affecting Black people, and how can we speak to that injustice, make more people aware of that injustice, and bring about change, to help with that.
Well, Tasha, I think to point that question a little bit more too, like I think we need to start with, how is the pandemic affecting the Black queer community right now? Like, what are the disparities that we see that are being highlighted right now? And I think that we can start there, and this is going to be a really good part of our discussion.
Yeah, not having a mortgage freeze. So there's no rent freeze. So people got to pay their rent, and they have to go out and work. And if their jobs are closed, then they have to find another job. And not everyone, I'm thinking of young adults in particular, if you have been claimed on your parents' taxes, you're not necessarily going to get your stimulus. So where is our money coming from?
Yeah, and disproportionately, you'll see, especially younger Black folks, and I don't know the numbers and how this specifically impacts the queer community, or the queer community in Richmond rather, but you statistically are seeing more and more Black folks who are not employed in jobs where you can work from home, right? You don't have access to those lines of income where you're able to be in a work from home, job secure environment. So you've got unemployment, underemployment, and then now add in food insecurities as well too in some of these situations, and most of these situations. Like, these are things we're starting to see. What else?
So if I can add, as I mentioned, I have a science background, and just from the question of how it's disproportionately taking our lives, as underrepresented minorities, as Black people, I'm trying to get away from using the term people of color when there are Black issues, and just relying on the term Black. With Black people, it is known that we have a lot of health disparities and a lot of health issues that are unresolved and not being looked at in the science community. So my background is cancer biology, and we are disproportionately affected by many different cancers. One in particular, Black women tend to get breast cancer a lot sooner than white women, especially the type of breast cancer that's so aggressive that they'll die within 6 months usually. And so knowing that we have these already these health issues, this virus is only going to play upon that. So if you are a person who already is suffering from something, this virus is only going to cause you to die quicker from it. And so I think the conversation, the questions need to be, at least for science, from my perspective and what I do and the work that I do, is having more people of color doing the research for us, looking at our bodies, looking at what we're doing and designing clinical trials for ourselves. We typically do not trust white doctors. We don't trust white scientists. We don't trust people to come to our door and say, hey, can I draw your blood for this test or ask you some questions? We don't trust that. We want to do it from those in our community. And so we need to have more people going into these fields and into these worlds, that are doing the work. And it's difficult because I'm kind of jumping all over the place, but it's difficult because me being a Black man who got my PhD from UVA in biology was tough. And I chose not to move in the realm of doing disease work anymore because I don't want to be popular amongst white people. And so I was like, I'm done with this world. I'd rather help people move into this world. And then it's difficult to talk with students and have them and say to students, like, this is what you need to do, get your PhD, do this work, do this research, to help make things better. That's something that I'm working on now. That's something that I'm figuring out. And one of the areas that one of the places that I think is so beneficial for Black people are HBCUs, and going to those, being in that world and being around Black people who are doing just as good as you are, that you can see other Black people with PhDs, so you know what it looks like to be successful. And so having Black scientists look at our bodies, look at what the virus is doing for us, and not just white people. Majority of the scientists are looking at white bodies, looking at white people, looking at everyone else and not us. We're just going to die anyway, and so they're just going to throw us to the side. It doesn't matter. And again, we're less than. We're not worthy, so it doesn't even matter to look at us.
We've got these like godlike pain thresholds, right? Like, why bother invest in things that also contribute to our well-being? Yeah.
I was going to say that in addition to those white scientists being incredibly gung-ho to use Black bodies as test subjects for whatever concoction cure they may think is going to cure the world.
The disinfectant, you mean?
You know, let's talk about it. VCU, this is right here at home. You know, people seem to always wonder why we feel the way we feel, and why we're, so angry about things, and why we can't just get over things. But we have a history littered with just, painful afflictions. And what happened at VCU is one of them. You cannot deny that, there were doctors and medical professionals actively seeking Black bodies to experiment on, and then discarded them as if they were, just meaningless. It was just, just tossed out. And that's just another example of the, egregious injustice that we face all the time. We all, Morgan, you said you're from here. Dr. Tim, I'm not sure if you're from here, but I know if you grew up here, we were told not to hang out around VCU
at night.
Don't be going out walking by yourself. You could get snatched.
My mother told me that, and I thought, wow, that's a little kooky, but she told me the reasoning, you would see somebody one day and you're not going to see them.
Yeah. And these are the stories that we hear as residents of Richmond, as people who live in the same society as our allies, right? And people who are not our allies. We live in this society as well, and what we have to do to protect ourselves, and what our parents and grandparents and ancestors have told us time and time again, is to stay away from VCU. Don't trust them. Don't go there. So how can we equally live in a society where we don't even have the same access. Literally, we don't want to walk into the building because we're afraid we won't make it out.
Mm-hmm.
So how can we, where that is injustice, and we are asking our allies to speak to it. It was who was that? Dr. I'll get it for you, Adam. I'll get it for you.
I think someone posted it in the chat. Until the wells run dry, medicine and exploitation of Black bodies.
Well runs dry. That is a real thing that really happened to Black people in this city. And it's atrocious. So please educate yourselves on that injustice and help us to fight things like this moving forward.
And I'm thinking about myself as a 23-year-old, and it is 2020, and that is an anecdote that I know very well. And thinking about all of the allies who right now who are watching, who are shocked. And so, I challenge you to reflect on that feeling of being shocked. However old you are, thinking about your experience, if you do live in Richmond, if your family has lived in Richmond, it is difficult to think about older generations. My mom is turning 60 this year, not knowing that anecdote. So think of all of the things that you are not told about your own people, white people, and, maybe even your family members that were a part of this using and discarding of Black bodies in this city.
Absolutely, absolutely. So we're just gonna jump back into a few more questions. It is now 8:30. I do see, let's see, I think we have too many more questions in the chat. But one question I do see here, and this is one of the questions that we had spoken about. How are we approaching conversations with the Black cishet community about being more inclusive to the Black LGBTQIA community concerning Black Lives Matter and just the injustices that we all share? And I want to preface that question with, if we are not as the people on this panelist, we're all Black people here. So if you are not comfortable answering that question in mixed company, please say so. And we do not have to go there.
So I am gonna have to go, but can you repeat the question? Maybe I have something to offer before I leave.
Sure, definitely. The question is, how are we connecting with the greater Black community for all of us to join together in this fight, because all too often we are not included. And when I say we, I mean queer Black people are not generally included in the greater Black lives, Black injustice movement. And we see that when queer people of color die, their names are not said, and they're not even said by the greater Black community, right? So how do we start to make that inroad with the people of our community to include us and to fight for us as well in this battle that affects all of us?
I did my dissertation. I mean, now it's been some years ago, but I wrote my dissertation on the experiences of Black lesbian and bisexual female students at historically Black colleges. And so I spent a lot of years trying to do work around heterosexism and gender oppression in Black communities. And I did find some support for it, mostly like in academic spaces. I was kind of surprised, frankly. But but outside of that, in more traditional or conservative Black spaces that are also religious, it was just a lot. And I just decided I just didn't have it in me to keep trying to fight that battle, which isn't to say doing anti-racism work with white people is easy. But yeah, I just had to leave it to some other people. It just took something out of me, I think, to continually go up against people who look like me, who didn't see my humanity, my full humanity. And it was just, I think just particularly painful. And I just decided not to keep doing it anymore.
With these emerging organizations, speaking specifically for Black, queer, and trans people, setting boundaries with the organizations that you choose to do work with, as well as having a clear list of objectives. Setting boundaries is one thing that, even in interpersonal relationships is incredibly important, but I don't think that organizations understand that, yes, we're doing the work together, but that your inability to see and acknowledge my humanity is breaking me down just as much as what we're trying to fight. And so our ability to step into the space is one thing, and acknowledge that we hold value in ourselves, not to be messed around, not to be, brushed under the rug or misgendered, given the wrong pronouns, time and time. No, boundaries need to be set with organizations that we choose to do work with.
I just want to jump in here. I do need to go, and I just didn't want to be rude about it. But I have another commitment, and I appreciate being able to participate and everybody being here tonight. Thank you.
And thank you for being here, because it's not easy for any of us to be on this call trying to speak on these issues with having very little time to process everything we've experienced over the last week. So thank you for your labor that you just gave us. We greatly appreciate that. We know it was for the better.
Thank you.
Thanks. Take care.
So with that said, I think we can come to a point where we can wrap it up and ask our final question of the evening of our panelists. And that would be, what should we be reading, studying, learning in order to make us better social change advocates if this is the first time we're being called to demand social justice in the spaces where we work, live, and love? Any examples of specific text or books or lectures, documentaries? Where do you get your information?
So I learn best when I hear things and when someone's speaking to me. So I learn interpersonally, and these type of conversations I often find myself in, because this is how I learn best. Because reading is not for everybody, but it is fundamental and it's very important. So I did make a list. So text would include, in general, books on community organizing, because those are incredibly important. This title, where is it? Great. Unapologetic, I'm going to drop it in the chat, but it's called Unapologetic, a Black Queer Feminist Mandate for Radical Movements
Great book.
by Charlene Carruthers. I'm going to copy and paste and drop that in there for everybody.
And this question is also for our participants listening today. If there is a resource, a wealth of knowledge that you have access to that you want to share, please drop that in the chat. We will also be making everything that we're discussing today as far as resources and lists of organizations available to you all through social media. So we highly, again, encourage you to connect with us on Facebook and Instagram at Black Pride RVA.
Bell Hooks, Marcus Garvey. Fire next time, James Baldwin. Read all of James Baldwin.
All of James Baldwin.
Read all of it.
All of it.
All on audiobook too.
I'm an audiobook person. Yeah, I'm an audiobook person. One thing that I want to add in there is that in order to be a good advocate, you also have to protect yourself mentally, spiritually, and physically. And so mental health will be important. And one book, I've not read it yet, but I've heard great things about it. And the book is called Unapologetic Guide to Black Mental Health. Navigate an unequal system, learn tools for emotional wellness, and get the help you deserve. And so, yeah, I'll put it in the chat. But I've heard really great things about it. It's one book that it's on my to-do list while I am working from home. I don't read anything since I've gotten my PhD. I don't read nothing. So I did everything from audiobooks and podcasts because I just don't have it in me to read anymore.
You proved you could read it.
Yeah, I was like, I don't have it in me to read anymore, and I just don't. I choose not to read. But that will be in one of my audiobooks that I get to listen to. And then for those if you are an academic person, a book that I finished reading was called The Privileged Poor. It's about Black student experiences at PWIs. And what does that look like? And identifying that we are not one group of Black students at predominantly white institutions, that we have different dynamics and different backgrounds that can influence how we strive in those environments. And it was a really great book, a really, really easy read. It shares a lot of good stories from different students, from those who are from very, very poor cities and communities who go to the Harvards and Yales, who don't have the background and they're not familiar with their white counterparts who travel to Aspen or go on these lavish vacations to Italy and France. They're not aware of that. But then it also looks at the students who come from those same communities, but were able to go to prep programs their last year before they went to college, and that they were able to successfully navigate those spaces a little bit differently, but they also still had their own issues because being Black in that space still is going to keep you, it's going to bring you down no matter what.
Absolutely. So. You're always reminded, yeah.
We got two more. One. I just finished Thick.
Okay.
So screenshot that, do what you need to do.
Yes.
Can you put it back up?
Yes.
And talk, because Natasha's face is still on the screen.
Oh, yes. Okay, so here's Thick. I just finished it. It touches a little bit on what Dr. Raines was saying. This is an autobiography, and it's just a striking collection of work that I enjoyed as a break from everything that's going on right now, but it's still incredibly informative in terms of what the Black experience is moving through PWIs in a professional academic setting, and also in terms of being a student. So that was super dope. And then counter narratives from women of color in academics. And that is a collection of essays from women in academia who range in positions. However, they're talking about their experiences predominantly in PWIs and what it's like as a woman of color to navigate that space, to speak up for themselves, to speak up for their students, and the misrepresented minoritized populations, within those settings. So I will write down that last one because it's a long.
So one of the ones that I'm definitely recommending to all of my white allies who want to know where to start, because I always tell them you need to educate yourself first. Like, that's where you start. Don't go speaking without a little bit of knowledge to back you up. Is Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow. I don't know if any of you have read that book, or for those that don't like to read, even though it is fundamental, the Netflix documentary 13th is an easy recommendation for white allies to see a broader picture of how the history of events that we've faced in our lived collective experience contribute to the oppression and that we see today, and that undoing the myth that we live in a post-racial society. Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow really outlines the prison, the school to prison pipeline in the industrial prison complex. And there are a lot of really eye-opening things that when I read that book, I was like, whoa, you know? So when my white allies read that book, I know that that would be a great place for them to start as well. And to begin to just at the surface comprehend the oppression that we are fighting actively day in and day out, because it's systematically embedded into the way that we live our lives and the way that our elected officials make decisions for us. So that would be what I would recommend. Tasha, what do you have?
So I would recommend, so 3 things, right? These are not books in particular, but these are instances of police brutality attached to great fighters for civil rights, right? So as I mentioned in the beginning of this, Fred Hampton. Fred Hampton was murdered by the police in his bed next to his pregnant partner. He was murdered by the police, as well as Medgar Evers, who was murdered in the driveway as his family watched by the police. And I know a lot of people don't know this, but in 1999, the United States government was convicted of conspiracy in a civil case. And it was a conspiracy because it was local, state, and federal government agencies in the murder of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. So I would seek for people to educate themselves about that, because as much, and especially as much as people nowadays are, people love MLK, right? Like all races. MLK has been able to transcend what, peace and justice can represent in this country, right? But the flip side of that is he is also a victim of police brutality. Because I assure you, it wasn't the EPA they sent out to murder King. It, local, state, and federal government murder is handed down at by the hand of the police. So everyone's idol, America's favorite Black guy, you know what I mean, was murdered by the police. Okay, so this is, we're not joking. We're not joking. And we're not being dishonest when we say that this is a systemic issue, and it is it has been generational, So I would ask our allies to educate yourselves really on how deep and how long police brutality has been taking place in this country, because it's these recent killings. They've all been filmed, and so they're all, easily able to spread. But we, Black people in this country, have been getting killed by the police unjustly forever.
This is not new.
The more you know, the more you can start to see why the anger is there, why the want to burn it down is there, Educate yourselves on why, the actual why of why we were angry now, and that is police brutality, long-standing police brutality in this country.
Absolutely. Are there any, thank you for sharing that with us too, Natasha, and I think that that's an important thing to realize too, is that we're not always going to only learn what we need to know through the books and through the documentaries that exist, when we could look at the actual cases of what's happened in history and read the facts in those cases for ourselves to tell us all the stories that we need to know to prove that this exists. You know, to create the same outrage that people get over property damage that they should have over the loss of Black life at the hands of unjust folks who are sworn to protect and serve. Do we want to read through a list of anything that the audience is suggesting right now as far as educational references?
I'm saying My Skin Was My Sin, The Progeny of Africa in America. I have a great short read, New Black Math by Susan Laurie Parks. Ta-Nehisi Coates, you know, pretty much all of his
entire work, yeah,
relevant, right? Between the World and Me are specifically stated here. Let me see. I'm reading here that there's a bill that's supposed to be brought to the U.S., to the floor of the U.S. House on Thursday, calling for the end to court protection for police. This is very important. Ending Qualified Immunity Act is what they're calling it. This will allow police to be sued for illegal and unconstitutional acts by victims. So you can reach out to your state representatives to support that bill. That is very important. I don't know if you guys actually watch this, but there's a show on Netflix with I forget the gentleman's name, but he actually had a whole show about this and how the police are Hassan Minaj. Yeah, his name is Hassan Minaj, and he had an entire episode about how the police literally legally cannot be held accountable for egregious actions because of that qualified immunity. So that's definitely important legislation that I definitely ask everyone on this panel to participate in, contacting their state reps and helping to get that bill
passed. And what other questions might we have in the chat? I was trying to, I'm on my iPad, my laptop wouldn't let me log out of my corporate Zoom, so I couldn't figure out how to get on my computer here. So the chats were moving so quickly, I couldn't read them all. Were there other questions in the chat that we wanted to get through? In the next couple of minutes.
So I am reading through here. I've got another book recommendation. Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? That one's a classic. Let me skip over here to the Q&A. Here's a question. How can we better establish equity over equality in queer spaces?
Ooh.
So when those spaces are created, making sure that all of the voices in the room are there, so you don't have to amend and add people, because when you add people, they can be thrown away just as quickly.
No, I agree. I was along the lines of what you just said, Morgan, making sure everyone's at the table, and that ensuring that those that are, so when it comes to equity versus equality, equity is ensuring that we bring everyone up together, that they have the same resources and same access, essentially is how I view it. And so when I think of this in queer spaces, I think of, again, I think even amongst the queer community, trans is considered less than. And so making sure that there is no less than in our communities and making sure that they are being treated equitably amongst everything.
As well as youth. Yes, and opening youth, having a youth seat if you are on board, having a youth voice, that these are the people within the next couple of years that will be, taking your positions, and that will be running, whatever you are starting. So having that voice and figuring out how you can connect with those communities on the front end is important as well.
Very good, very good. Any closing comments before we wrap up?
I just wanted to say that also there was a question, we answered a couple questions in text form, but this question that came up as well as a queer Black man in Stonewall Sports, which is a national sports organization that is queer, hence Stonewall Sports. As a queer Black man in Stonewall Sports, I love being a part of this community, especially after moving here a year ago. But how can I help my league here support the Black community more in Richmond? And how can I introduce more diversity to this league? I was just going to, with a lot of extracurricular sports or club run things, they're made for people who have time, and that's not often us. We are not often the people who have the money or the time just to pick up and do a sport on the weekends. We have to work. But when we are able to be in those spaces, they are predominantly white led and filled with white bodies. And as we know in the queer community, those sports organizations tend to be a peacock show for cis white men trying to show off and flaunt to other cis white men. So where do we see ourselves in those spaces, and how do we navigate not only our mental health, but physically? And so I'd say me being a part of that organization as well, and my partner being the chair of the Diversity and Inclusion Committee, talk to them. But also as a participant who has friends, who has team members within this organization, apply pressure to the board. Apply pressure to the board. This organization was inaugurated by white men, and if you aren't seeing what you want in this organization, don't stop yelling, screaming. Don't ask nicely for anything, because it'll get swept under the rug. So do your work with the DIC and apply pressure to the board.
Very good. And Morgan, I want to also touch on one topic that we think about when we think about any organization, right? Like sports league, business, library, whatever the case may be, where there are folks gathering and we need folks to gather to sustain the organization. One of the things that we need to think about when we think about diversity and inclusion, it starts at the recruiting point. So where are you looking for folks to join the organization? And do they have access to the materials that they need to become a part of your greater organization? Are you intentionally looking to diversify the folks that make up the organization that you are a part of? And you listed the names of a couple of organizations, and I remember being new to Richmond, just moving here 4 years ago, and looking at those organizations to see if I could build community, and I didn't see myself represented in those spaces. And those are times where I wish I would have kept going. I wish I would have pressed harder. I wish I would have known who to press on. So that's very, that resonates with me, and I thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, I started Stonewall Sports from the first kickball season. And I was really a fly in the buttermilk. I joined with my other theater queens, who I, as the first Black woman on that team, was asked, where are the other queer Black women that we can get to occupy the space? And I think that it's difficult to ask that of someone when they don't feel safe in the space to begin with, for them to occupy some space that they do not feel comfortable being in. So having this DIC created, I think 1.5 years ago, where Stonewall was created 3 or 4 years ago, is really, it's telling.
Good. Well, I'm excited to see the fruits of that labor. I'll revisit. I'll give another chance.
Please do, join my team.
Hey, I've been recruited. You see that? Recruiting just came into the space where Black people are. Dr. Rains, do you have any additional comments that you want to leave us with?
Stay safe. Protect your mental and emotional and spiritual health as much as possible during this time. It is okay to disconnect. when you need to, and it is okay to be angry if you feel angry. It's okay to be sad, and it's okay to, again, just disconnect if you need to. Let's give yourself grace during this time.
Thank you. Thank you. Tasha?
I just want to thank everybody for participating tonight and hanging on. I know a 2-hour Zoom is usually out of everybody's wheelhouse, but I am very happy to see that the number of people on here has not gone down substantially, and so I hope that each of you have been able to take value from this conversation, and I also hope that each of you are able to go back into your homes and into the community that we all share, and start to truly express what this equity will look like. What does justice for all of us look like? And I also want to just reiterate that when Black people say no justice, no peace, that's really it. So
we out here in these streets.
No justice, no peace. Stay dangerous, y'all.
Thank you. And so I want to thank everybody for joining us. And I want to remind everybody that speaking up matters now more than ever. Doing something matters now more than ever. Reminding you all that one man held his knee to the back of another's neck, and now he is dead. And at least three folks could have made a difference and chose not to. 3 folks in power chose not to. So if you don't think that what you learned from this conversation today can be applied and shared, and that it might be able to be used to change the perspective, or at least the position of, or the disposition of someone who is in power to do something, to say something, you're mistaken, because you do have that power. Like, you do have that power to share that knowledge and to do something and to say something. And your silence is violence at this point. And your silence, and I say this to our allies, but I also say this to some of us on this call, silence when we have the opportunity in the space is violence. So I encourage you, I implore you to get out there and do the work. And to the Black folk on the call, when we are tired, find us a white folk, white allies who can go out there and help us when we need to rest, because we do need to rest our voices, because it shouldn't be our voices doing the work to begin with. I want to thank you all again for joining us. I want to remind you that we will be listing information that we shared today on our social media platforms. If there is something more that you want from sessions like these, if you want to see more sessions like these in the future, please reach out and let us know. We'd love to hear from you. And on behalf of Black Pride RVA and Us Giving Richmond Connections, thank you all. Have a good night. Wash your hands. Hide your kids. Have a good one.